Hey guys, and welcome to my SimRacers perspective review of F1 2021. Now, those of you who have been following the channel for a while now will know that I've sunk more hours than I care to admit into Codemasters' previous F1 offerings, but as I've progressed through my sim racing journey into more high-end hardware, the lack of perspective-corrected triple screen or VR support has meant that I don't really spend as much time in these games as I used to once upon a time. Nonetheless, every time a new title drops, I'm always excited to see what improvements have been made, so let's dive in today and see how F1 2021, the first F1 title since EA's Takeover, stacks up. Now, throughout the review process, I've played this game on a single monitor with graphics set to ultra high and ray tracing on to present the game in its best possible form. All the footage that you're seeing in this video is recorded by myself during the review process, but just do keep in mind that depending on the hardware that you're using, your experience will of course vary, so make sure that you do pay attention to the game's minimum and recommended system requirements. The marketing for F1 2021 has placed a very heavy focus this year on story mode known as Breaking Point. Now, in Breaking Point, you roleplay as two characters, Aiden Jackson and Casper Ackerman, battling primarily against the series antagonist Devin Butler. As a sim racer, I wasn't particularly hyped for the new story mode, as I generally prefer to just jump into a championship and play through it my own way, but I did end up finding Breaking Point to be a valuable part of this game. I was quickly absorbed by the story, which takes around 3 hours to complete, assuming no restarts, of course. Now, without any spoilers for you guys, the story follows through the ups and downs of the dynamics between Aiden, a newcomer to F1 and potential star of the future, and Casper, an older and more experienced driver. The plot has quite a drive to survive kind of vibe to it, which I'm sure is intentional, and it can be a little bit repetitive at times, in particular the phone calls to Aiden's mum and Casper's partner. And while the story is somewhat outcome-based, there's not a huge amount of interactivity to it. That said, it does serve as a great gateway into the world of Formula 1 for newcomers and means less confusion for new players later on as they tackle the more complex game modes. So thumbs up there, but even if the story mode isn't for you, there's plenty more to sink your teeth into. As was the case with F1 2020, this year's game was always going to be a little bit awkward when it came to replicating the real-life 2021 F1 season, simply due to the dynamics of trying to adapt to meet requirements around the world around pandemic restrictions. So as such, there are a couple of tracks that aren't in the game right now, Portimao, Imola and Jeddah, but these will be added to the calendar later on as DLC content for the game, so that's good to hear. So along with the new tracks and of course Breaking Point, there are a couple of other very exciting features, at least I think so, to the mix this year as well. So we now have a multiplayer co-op mode, and that allows you to play through the game as teammates in a single team or individually in the same championship, fighting in different teams as well. And this is definitely something that we'll be exploring later on in future videos. My Team was a very popular feature in last year's game as well. It does make an appearance again in 2021. This allows you to play as an 11th team and develop your car over the course of a season to compete with the best of the best. Real Season Start adds a fun new element to the game as well, allowing you to jump in at any point throughout the real-life F1 2021 championship to date and align with the current point standings. We also have some new realism modes this year as well. So F1 games from Codemasters have always been quite good at striking a healthy balance between making the games accessible for new players and, you know, something that the mainstream enthusiast community will be likely to play, as well as sim racers. Now, a lot of people would say that these F1 games aren't really true sims, and that is definitely the case, as we'll explore a little bit later on. But having these new game modes does make the game a little bit more accessible for newcomers and those playing with basic controllers, but it also does cater for people right through to those who are looking for a more realistic experience, complete with mechanical failures, of course, as well. And that provides us with a great segue into discussing physics and handling in F1 2021. So F1 2021 feels like an incremental upgrade when it comes to physics and car handling, but definitely a step in the right direction when it comes to simulation. As a AAA title, it's always going to be a bit of a compromise between retaining instant gratification style gameplay and hardcore simulation. The cars generally feel more connected to the road than they have in previous titles. I found that some of the exploits that I've used in previous iterations of the game were less effective in this one. So curbs unsettle the car a little bit more, and with assists off, you really do have to be careful with your throttle application. That was starting to become more of a thing in F1 2020, but definitely more the case in 2021. In real life, a tyre only has a limited amount of grip available, and the driver has to balance their inputs between cornering, braking and accelerating to keep the tyres within their limits. This is known in the racing world as a traction circle, and staying within this traction circle in F1 2021 is noticeably more important than it has been in previous titles, which lends me to feel that this is a more realistic game overall than previous generations have been. Overdriving the car typically results in a spin or just generally slower lap times. Tyre temperature and degradation is something that I've always found particularly good in the more recent F1 games from Codemasters, and this remains strong in F1 2021 as well, providing a very dynamic driving experience and adding a realistic strategic element to the game too. Overdriving the car will of course result in overheating your tyres, and this can very easily cost you a race or end up with you spinning and sliding the rear of the car. And having a spin, of course, will also overheat the tyre surface, which results in significantly reduced grip until those tyres cool down again. So are the physics perfect? Well, no, not really, and there's a couple of things that I think stood out in particular as needing a little bit of work. Most notably, the transition from wet to dry and vice versa still feels like it could use a little bit more work, and it's not as progressive as I believe it would be in real life. In my experience so far, the track tends to still remain close to kind of dry grip levels, even with slick tyres, right up until the point where the track becomes fully wet and DRS is disabled by race control. At this point, it's like a switch is flicked and the cars become almost undrivable until intermediate or wet tyres are fitted. That said though, the transition between high downforce grip at high speed and mechanical grip at low speed is very well handled in wet conditions and does seem noticeably improved over F1 2020. A few other things I think could use some work in the physics department are the grip levels off the racing line, dirty air physics, as well as balance of performance. Once you get familiar with the handling, it is quite easy to drive around a slower car on the outside of the track off the racing line, with little regard for the reduced grip that you would expect to find in real life off in the marbles, for example. I did expect it to be a little bit more difficult in the game to follow other cars in dirty air. Didn't really find that to be too much of a significant problem as it is in the real life season, and I have noticed some strange behavior in balance of performance between cars. For example, if I get an exceptionally great corner exit and have a really good run on an opponent out of a corner and I'm in the slipstream, I can be slingshotting past them at a high rate of speed, only to find that a moment later their car's actually traveling faster than mine again. It's almost as if there's like some sort of a catch-up effect taking place, like we used to have in some older arcade games. Of course, some cars are going to be faster than others, and that is to be expected, that is realistic, but something just doesn't feel quite right about it, particularly when playing at lower AI difficulty levels. Many of the AR cars are unrealistically slow on corner exit, but then seem to get a massive acceleration boost on the straights regardless of their corner exit. I've said for a few years now that the AI in Codemasters F1 games is among some of the best in the sim racing industry, and this year's game is no exception. Other drivers defend in a very realistic manner in keeping with F1's rather strict rules around weaving and blocking and braking zones. And I also noticed other drivers were slightly less likely to just duck out of the way the moment you showed them a wheel up the inside, which makes racing a lot more dynamic and less predictable. Now, one of my biggest gripes with previous games was how lapped AI traffic behaved. It had a tendency to park on the apex as you approached, leaving you scrambling to find a way past at the last minute, and often resulting in the need to use one of those frowned upon flashbacks. But so far, I haven't found this to be a problem in F1 2021, which is really good news. Cars get out of the way under blue flags in a very realistic manner, again in keeping with the real F1 regulations. F1 2021 also sees an updated damage model, which adds side pod and barge board damage, among other things. Now, in my experience so far, this does add a realistic new element to the driving, because while front wing damage is still most likely in a scenario where there's car-to-car contact, front wings can be replaced in a pit stop, but in other areas of the car, if they become damaged, you're stuck with it for the remainder of the race. So that does change the overall dynamic, because you have to think more about how you're going to manage the race from that point on. Tyre failures do still occur, and they are more realistic this year as well, with the carcass slowly separating from the sidewalls as you limp back to the pits. We still, of course, have all the expected car setup elements, which remain largely unchanged from previous iterations of the game, but do allow more experienced drivers to extract the maximum from the cars, albeit at times to the extent of perhaps bending the physics just a little bit. So let's talk a little bit more about controls and force feedback now. I don't have a current generation console, so these observations all relate to the PC version of the game. There were no problems at all detecting any of the wheelbases that I have at my disposal, including my SimuCube 2 Ultimate, my VRS Direct Force Pro, or any of the current range of Fanatec wheelbases, including the CSL DD. One thing I did notice, however, was that the button mapping was a little bit hit and miss with some of my wheels. I was disappointed that I couldn't use the 7-way funky switches on my Asher Racing F64 V2 USB wheel, for example. It simply wouldn't allow me to map those buttons for use with the multifunction display or navigating menus, which was very disappointing. So obviously I can't test every single wheel that's on the market, but you may find that some of the wheels that you might want to use this with might be a little bit finicky. Now there are ways around that using third-party programs like Joy2Key, for example, but just something that I wanted to make sure you guys were aware of. I will say, however, that the game works particularly well with the Fnatic Formula V2 or the newer V2.5, as well as the limited edition F1 wheels, as you would expect. So much so that if I was building a rig to play this game exclusively, I would absolutely be doing so with either a CSL DD or a Podium DD1 and a V2.5 wheel. Regardless of whether you're navigating menus, multifunction displays, or just tweaking and trimming settings, the Fnatic ecosystem seems to have the game best covered when it comes to functionality. As for the force feedback itself, while the in-game settings are limited to your typical adjustments for overall strength, individual effect strength, and of course damper, using a combination of these settings along with driver level adjustments, I was able to find force feedback settings which were quite impressive to me across every single wheelbase that I tested with. Effects like ripple strips and road textures have always been quite good in recent titles from the franchise, but in past titles I have noticed that the force feedback tends to feel quite vague right around the limits of grip or the thresholds of grip through the tyres. Didn't really get a really strong sensation of exactly what was going on with the car right on those limits. But with F1 2021, I found myself able to adjust quite quickly and develop a good understanding of what the car was doing at its limits quite instinctively. I was able to catch snap oversteer moments, which do happen quite frequently in this game, and also found understeer to feel more progressive than it has in previous titles. The fastest way to brake in most race cars is to apply enough braking pressure that the tyres just start to under-rotate without locking up, of course, and I found the force feedback provided me with the tools required to achieve this very consistently in F1 2021. Now, as far as graphics are concerned, I think it's fair to say that F1 2021 is an incremental improvement, certainly not breaking any new ground here and still running the same graphics engine that's been in place since 2015, albeit with a few enhancements to add some things like resolution scaling, more advanced lighting effects, and of course ray tracing. As mentioned earlier in the video, the footage that you're seeing was all recorded from my own gameplay at maximum settings, but the graphics in the more recent F1 games were already pretty fantastic, and there were some noticeable improvements in some of the finer details in F1 2021. Now, it's also worth mentioning here that the graphics engine does appear to be quite well optimized too. The micro-freezing issues which plagued F1 2018 and 2019 for some users, including myself, appear to be resolved as they were in F1 2020, and importantly, I didn't have a single game crash throughout my entire 6+ hours of testing F1 2021, something that certainly can't be said for 2019 or 2020 running on the exact same system here in the studio. With my overclocked 9900K and 3090 graphics card, I was able to achieve pretty stable frame rates above 70 frames per second with maxed out settings, including ray tracing at 4K resolution, and over 110 frames per second with ray tracing turned off. For those with less powerful systems, resolution scaling does work well to maintain a more consistent frame rate, so it's good to see that's carried over from F1 2020. Overall, between the improvements to graphics, physics, AI, and force feedback, I find F1 2021 to be a significantly more immersive and enjoyable experience than its predecessors. All those elements aside, however, where I think F1 2021 and its predecessors for that matter really comes into its own is more in the way it conveys the experience of being immersed in the world of Formula 1 to the player. Every element of the game, from the UI design, although I'm still begging for mouse support in the menus, to the soundtrack, which I think is the best soundtrack we've had in an F1 game since F1 2010, even just down to the cutscenes, the interviews, and the commentary from real-life personalities.
Edition for this, the inaugural round of the 2021 Formula 1 World Championship, and I've got to say, it feels great to be back.
For me, the best experiences in F1 2021 outside of multiplayer and league racing come from working my way through the career mode with full or 50% length weekends where I can participate in all 3 practice sessions, completing the tasks set out by the team, learning the track more intimately, and developing the car. Then through into the 3 full-length qualifying sessions where, of course, correct tyre selection, ERS management, and pit exit strategy timing play just as vital a role as they do in real life. And then through into the race where not only do you have to drive the car, but also plan and work with your engineer to execute the strategy. As is the case in real life, just being the fastest driver or having the fastest car isn't always enough to secure your rightful position based on raw pace, and split-second decisions can make or break you. Combine that with long-term strategies such as managing wear and tear on allocated components such as your engine and gearbox, as well as car development, and you've got what I think is the most immersive car racing game I've played to date. So to summarize my feelings about F1 2021 from a sim racer's perspective, I think if you're a hardcore sim racer hellbent on the pursuit of the most realistic raw driving experience when it comes to driving a car on the edge and working with things like chassis and tire flex, then this probably isn't the title for you. There's no denying that there are far more realistic driving simulations out there. But if you're after a game that you can pick up and enjoy at the drop of a hat at any skill level and be challenged, and something that deeply immerses you in the world of Formula One beyond just driving a car, then this is absolutely worth checking out. In my opinion, at least, it's easily the best F1 title to date, and while it's still not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, it will give you many hours of good, genuine fun. Now, while you can play on triple screens, the lack of perspective corrected triple screen support to avoid stretched side monitors is hugely disappointing, as well as the lack of VR support, and I know that these are going to be deal breakers for so many of us. And please, for the love of God, Codemasters, please add mouse support in the menus. But otherwise, honestly, I'm very impressed with the game. So I hope that you guys have found this review from a sim racer's perspective helpful. If you have, please do hit the thumbs up button to tell YouTube that this video is worth showing to other sim racers. And while you're down there, why not consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell too, so you don't miss out on future videos, including some more F1 content. And if you'd like to help support the channel as well, we do have some links down in the description below to help you do that. So thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you again soon. Bye.